Hello there, this is James Scrofty, 1978, and having mentioned in my previous video on this channel that, to paraphrase Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., what most of us want is negative peace, which is the absence of tension, rather than positive peace, which is the presence of justice, perhaps the supreme example of this bitter reality is the self-deluding pipe dream of colourblindness. The ludicrous conceit that we can't possibly be racist if we pretend to be incurably ignorant of the fact that different ethnicities exist, because obviously racism is simply hating people because they're different. So if we pretend that everyone is the same, then there'll be no racism. Apparently believing that Dylan Roof murdered 9 black churchgoers after yelling, "You rape our women and you're taking over our country," because racism is a specific form of obsessive-compulsive disorder. So if only we'd all stop triggering these poor racists by acknowledging racial differences, then surely no person of colour would ever be discriminated against, oppressed, persecuted, abused, harassed, beaten, or brutally murdered ever again.
The healthiest thing we can do is just ignore this and pretend it doesn't exist. Just like we do with the squid.
Earthquake.
Yeah, truck going by.
Of course, I've already explained what racism as it exists today in our society actually is, and why rich, powerful, and influential Anglo-Saxon and Germanic Protestants literally invented it in an earlier video, links down in the underbar. And so, sticking with the subject at hand, while the laughable conceit that if we regard everyone as being identical, then discrimination, oppression, and persecution would cease to exist, is utterly ludicrous, with people using euphemisms to avoid admitting that they are literally telling themselves that if we all just ignore it, then it will go away. The underlying point which so many people miss in the face of this self-delusional absurdity is that convincing themselves that they are solving the problem by literally ignoring it is part of the true defining purpose of self-proclaimed colourblindness, namely to make the person in question feel better. After all, in a world in which, as I've discussed in countless previous videos, people are more outraged by the mere implication that they themselves are racist than they are by the police murdering unarmed children because they were black and therefore dangerous animals. Nope, no racism here. Post-racial society, everyone. Just close your eyes, plug your ears, and pretend that everyone is equal now. La 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 la, I'm not listening. The only issue that matters for the type of people who claim colourblindness is, do people think that I'm racist? Living in fear of any mention or discussion of racial issues because it makes them feel uncomfortable and threatened, and worse, fearing that if they say or do anything wrong or anything that could be taken the wrong way, then they'll be condemned as a racist, and according to the definition of racism that we as white people have imposed over the last few decades to make ourselves feel better as well by making ourselves the good guys by default, explaining this being the point of my previous video, which I've already cited, links below. Only inherently and irredeemably bad people, meaning people who we don't like or support, can ever be genuinely racist. Hence, the ridiculously knee-jerk overreactions and endless protestations of "but I'm a nice guy," which many people of colour and white allies face when we simply point out that something is racially insensitive and ask the people in question to change it, while in the very next breath they condemn Black Lives Matter as white-hating black supremacists, because not automatically putting white people on the list of people whose lives matter reminds us that we are no longer the centre of the universe, and that hurts our delicate white feelings.
This is all about me. Me.
And so, in the apotheosis of this moral egocentrism, the self-proclaimed colourblind strike an unspoken deal with the rest of the world that I'll pretend that you're not different as long as you do. On the face of it, hoping to keep up the pretense that race doesn't exist in order to avoid feeling uncomfortable, judged or threatened for as long as humanly possible, with the only problem being, of course, that just as is the case with all self-delusions, reality will always break through in the end, because even even if everyone in the world could agree to stop being different, that promise would inevitably be broken the second that it was made, because people are different. Full stop. But then, the moment when the unspoken contract is broken, that is when the true and self-righteously passive-aggressive purpose of colourblindness is revealed, because in that moment, with no effort whatsoever, the self-deluded shield of colourblindness is turned back around upon the other as a self-righteous and sanctimonious club with which to beat them over the head and thus make ourselves feel even more morally superior, because I don't see race. This is a post-racial society. You are the ones who are failing to assimilate. You are the ones imposing your primitive and inferior culture upon the rest of us. And bearing in mind the absurd non-solution of see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, perhaps worst of all,
just stop talking about race. You are the one that's keeping racism alive.
And as some among you have hopefully gathered by now, although so-called colourblindness may be the supreme example of this self-righteous, self-serving and hypocritical need to spare our delicate feelings and to inflate our egos by declaring ourselves to be morally superior at every opportunity, it is far from being the only example, because every time we ever say anything along the lines of we don't care if people are gay, just as long as they keep it in the bedroom, don't care if they practice a different religion or culture, as long as they don't try to shove it down our throats, or that I don't care who does the job, as long as they're the most qualified, only to play the oppressed victim and defender of equality when they express the fact that they are different or request actual equality, accusing them of spreading their unnatural and inferior beliefs and behaviours, of indoctrinating children, and of being part of the evil leftist commie feminazi SJW plot to destroy society. The bottom line is always that we pretend problems don't exist by claiming that we have risen above such petty moral concerns, and then condemn anyone who points out that they do exist as being the actual bigots and supremacists, solely to protect and inflate our own fragile egos and to avoid our petty fear of change.
Jack's conception of a world where he's healthy is one in which sexism has largely been dealt with, where a misogynist is someone who beats his wife, and sexual assault is what happens in dark alleys with ski masks. The only way to deal with it is to shun, shame, or incarcerate the few remaining sexists. This often applies equally to Jack's understanding of other systemic social problems. To his mind, these are things he's not part of, or things he doesn't even believe exist, and he dutifully avoids anyone who might tell him different. Most of us who don't have phenomenally progressive parents grow up believing that this is the world, a world that, for all its flaws, is generally fair and just. And it's a beautiful world that most of us would rather live in, but it's an illusion. It's a bubble. And for most of the world that is not Jack, that bubble gets popped in adolescence or early adulthood, either by a traumatic event or a litany of microaggressions. For most, having the bubble popped is simply part of growing up. The ability to be a grown-ass adult and still believe that this is what sexism looks like is a predominantly male privilege. It's hard to read, for instance, Maddie Myers talk about getting manhandled by security guards at PAX, or not being taken seriously by men in the games industry if she wears a skirt, and still think that sexism begins and ends with battered women in ski masks. And Jack's solution for the discomfort he feels when reading these articles is, at least most of the time, not to read them. Misogyny doesn't happen to him, and it happens in front of him so infrequently, it's easy for him to write off as either isolated or inadmissible, and thus his bubble can be preserved well into adulthood. The thing about being a man in a world that favors men over women is that, with rare exception, nobody pops that bubble for you. You have to choose to pop it. People like Anita Sarkeesian present Jack with a world where his ability to get jobs, loans, and property has been amplified by his gender. A world in which he's been routinely given more than he deserves, even if what he has doesn't amount to much. A world whose problems he inherited from the past generation and has been contributing to his entire life. A world in which, however much things improve for women in his lifetime, he will profit off of institutional sexism until the day he dies. It's a world few of us want to live in, but Jack has the luxury of pretending he doesn't.